The walk input method is typically used for creating fine detail work, as well as creating travel stitches and occasionally a manual underlay. So let's take a look at how to use it and how to select it. If I go over to my input toolbar, it is by default the first input tool that we can use. To select it, left click on it. Now I have that tool selected. To begin digitizing with this tool, I typically start out with a left click. A left click is typically used for creating angles and straighter lines. So I'll start off with a left click. The line that is generated from that point to my mouse point will be the line of stitching as soon as I click again. So I will left click again to create a straight line in between those two. And again, wherever I want to create this line, if I want to create a curve, I'll use a right click, which will create a circle along that line, and it will begin to curve out from that. And that curve will not be fully defined until I left click or right click on the other side of it. I try not to exceed 180 degrees in any set of 3 points. 1, 2, 3, and I try not to exceed 180 degrees in that. When I'm ready to complete that element, I hit enter on my keyboard, and now that element is actually stitching. And if I put this into 3D, we can come in and look at what this stitching is actually doing. So it is one stitch right after the other. And this 3D mode will give you a nice idealistic view of what everything is. It's not going to compensate for the texture of material. So if I was sewing this on perhaps a terry cloth towel or polar fleece where those stitches are going to sink in and not be quite as visible, I'm not going to see that on my screen as much. If I look at creating some more complex shapes, it might be nice to have some artwork up to do that. I'm going to open up some artwork. It's in the graphics folder that's located on local disk C in my designs folder. I'm going to change this to all graphics. I'm going to open up lines.bmp. There we go. And this is a great graphic to learn to use the walk input method. So let me zoom in here a little bit. I'm going to click on my walk input method. I'm going to put everything in 3D so this is a little bit easier for you guys to see. And let's choose a slightly brighter color. So I can start on this line. I begin with a left click and I come all the way across. Now because this is a perfectly straight line, I don't want to add a lot of points along that line. The fewer points you use, the straighter your elements are going to be and the easier they're going to be to edit. It does not make a straighter line to add more straight points. I'm going to come all the way across. I also am going to hold the Alt key, and that's going to snap that line to 15-degree increments so that if my mouse isn't exactly on that perfect horizontal, it's not going to matter as much. I then left click, add that last point, and I'm going to hit enter to complete my shape, and now I have a line of stitching running right across that line. This propeller is the last stitch of the previous element, so I know where my last stitch was, and I know where I might start again. Let's do ourselves a little bit of a favor. Let's go to Tools and Options and Preferences, and I'm going to change the size of these points up to larger. Let me hit Apply and OK, and now these triangles should be a little bit easier to see. As I'm digitizing, yeah, they're a little bit easier to see now. So you can change the size of those to make it a little bit easier for yourself. I'm going to try to keep these a little bit bigger so it's easier for you guys to see in the video. Hit escape and get out of here. Let's look at this next line. Same thing. I'm going to start over here. This time I'm going to go the other direction, holding Alt the whole time. That keeps it completely straight. Left click again, and then I can hit enter to complete that shape. And you'll notice that there is now a piece of thread connecting those two. In the software there is a default that says if the connections are closer than this amount, don't trim. If they're farther apart than this amount, go ahead and trim. That is in the software. If I want to insert a trim in between those, I can select the first element in the project view or by clicking over here. And then I can click on that insert trim icon, and as soon as I do that, a little pair of scissors will show up and that piece of thread will go away. All right, so I'm going to grab my walk input method. I'm going to do the same thing down here. Start with a left click, come over holding Alt to keep that line perfectly straight, left click again, hit enter. So those 3 parallel lines are working really well for me. I probably want another trim in between there. Let me resequence this because I wasn't paying attention when I was talking to you guys. And insert that trim so that I remove that stitching. Now I'm going to pan over. Let's take a look at how to deal with a slightly more complex shape. So we've got this curve, and then we've got this nice angle right here, and then this curve coming up here. And when I do these types of things, let me bring up my marking program. When I do these types of shapes, typically I'll begin to divide my shape up in my head. And again, when I digitize, when I started out, I used to print things out and then draw on them, and sometimes I'd have tracing paper over that. I'm going to do this on screen so that you guys can see my thought process, but I would always kind of mark where I'd start and where my transitions are, and those are going to be those left clicks, those triangle points that make those sharp angles. And then, if I can, I'm going to try to almost bisect those curves or divide them right in the middle for my curve point, and that's going to make my life a little bit easier. It's also going to help me figure out, and I'll draw, I should have drawn a circle there because that's going to be the those right clicks or those curve points. That's going to help me use an economy of points and use fewer points as I digitize. So let me go back. Let me grab my digitizing tool again. So I'm going to come up here, grab my walk input method. I'm going to start here with a left click. I'm going to come up here, bisect that curve as best I can, right click. It's hidden behind my mark, but it's there. You can see that that arc is very reactive to where my mouse is. So I'm going to come all the way down. I have this sharp angle coming up, so I'm going to left click to create that nice sharp transition. I'm going to come across. I'm going to hold Alt to make sure that that stays nice and horizontal. Left click again because I'm going to create that transition again. Right click right in the middle of that curve. Come all the way up. Left click. Hit enter to complete my shape, and now I have a line of stitching that runs all the way across. Let me clear off those marks. And let's take a look. Minimize this, get it back out of the way, and let's go back to edit mode and take a look at how those points are lining up. So this circle that is green, that's showing where I'm starting out. This X that is red, that shows where I'm ending. And these triangles are my more angular or straight points. My circles are more of my curve points. That's going to be that right click. So I started here, bisect, changed sharply coming into this, curve, and straight point to finish that out. Now, this shape already has some of those hash marks on it. What I would consider doing with something like this, I know that this arc already exceeds 180 degrees. If I'm digitizing just one shape, I can start off with a left click. I can bisect this. I can do it, and DesignShop will help me out with it, but it is a little bit more difficult to control. Then I'll left click at the end. Because it exceeds 180 degrees, when I hit enter, DesignShop will begin to add a few more points in there for me. So I only put in this curve point. And because it's exceeding 180 degrees, DesignShop divided this up and added this curve point. And notice that it divided it right in the middle. So it added that curve point. That makes my life a little bit easier. Sometimes it would be easier to edit in a shape. If I move back over here, I could just digitize across this form. I could start with a left click, come across, left click, right click to bisect that curve, come up, left click, come across, left click, and hit enter to complete that shape. And that would work. But if I wanted to make sure that these two lines were absolutely even and completely parallel, it might actually be easier for me to edit in this curve. So let me take a look. I'm going to delete that. Let me take a look at how I might do that. So if I was doing something like that, I might start off with a left click, come all the way across, as few points as possible, right? Left click again, I've got a line going all the way across. I'm going to hit enter and complete that shape. So I've digitized just a line across. Now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to edit in those shapes. So I'm going to select my edit mode. I'm going to zoom in to make my life a little bit easier and so that you guys can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Now if I look at this shape, I've got all of these stitches coming across here, and right down the middle I have a blue line. If I hover my cursor over that blue line, you can see that I get a line beside my cursor. If I have this 4-directional arrow, that means that I can click and drag and move my element, but if I hover my cursor a little bit closer to that line, I get a line beside it, and that means that I can edit that line or that shape. So if I go to that transition, I can left click because I want that sharp angle transition. I'm going to do the same thing here. Now watch what happens as I click right here. I've got a needle penetration here, and I've got a needle penetration here, and as I move over, if I left click, my stitches will shift. So whenever you're inputting an input point into an element, whenever you're clicking either a left click or a right click, it will shift those stitches so that a needle penetration always falls right where you're clicking. So that's another reason I want you to be a little bit careful with the amount of input points that you're using. If you use a ton and start to scale them up or down, if you scale them down, you're going to start creating very, very small stitches, and that can be a problem. All right, so let's come back in. We've got these input points. Straight point here, straight point here. I want this to be a big curve in the middle, so I'm going to right click to allow myself a curve point. Now I can click and drag on this point and it will come down. Now when I do this, it's going to drag those Bezier handles with them. These little red lines with these little black squares, these are Bezier handles, and I can edit those handles individually. So I could try to make this all line up, make it all line up on here, but man, that's a lot of work. There is an easier way. If I hold control while I'm dragging this point. So I'm holding control on the keyboard, I'm dragging this point, it arcs out perfectly, so I can drag this down, arc that out perfectly, and now I know that the left and right sides of this are completely even, and I have a lovely perfect arc right in the middle. So sometimes, depending on how geometric your design is, it may be easier to edit in those shapes than actually digitize them. All right, one more kind of complex shape we've got here. We've got this S curve. So again, I'm going to think about using my left clicks as sharp angles or transitions and my right clicks as smoothing out these curves. I'm going to start with my walk tool. I'm going to come here, I'm going to left click, going to bisect that curve. DesignShop will add in those points for me. Come down, find where it's really, really starting to transition. So right about here, and this has hash marks to help you out. At least when you're practicing, when you start getting your own designs, you may want to put in your own hash marks. So I'm going to left click, I'm going to come across, left click again before I start this other curve, bisect that curve, divide it in half, come back up, left click. When I hit enter, I now have my stitches following that form. Same thing for these more complex shapes. We just keep getting more and more complex. Start here, left click, divide the curve in half, right, sharp angle, left, curve, right, sharp angle, left, right, left, right, left. This is a huge curve, and a lot of new digitizers will try to help it out by adding a bunch of curve points. That makes their lines a little uneven and makes editing this a nightmare. So I'm going to backspace those off there. I'm going to do the whole thing with one left click, and then in the middle a right click, and all the way up left click, and then coming back down. So we've got this huge transition. Doesn't matter because we've got this triangle left click right there. Right, left, right, left, right, left. And I'm going to end it here so that we can look at a couple of other things. I don't need to do this entire shape for you guys, but when I hit enter, I then generate those stitches, and you can see that, yeah, I really am following that shape fairly well. So that is how you would use the walk input method. As I'm digitizing, if I make a mistake, I can hit backspace, and it will remove the last input point, and I can continue doing that. If I want to get out of the element that I've created, I could also hit escape, and that would remove the element that I've been creating, but it would keep the tool selected. If I want out of that as well, I would hit escape again. So escape twice is kind of get me out of everything. I don't want to touch any of the input tools. I just want to look at my design again. Let me select that tool again. So again, digitizing along, made a wrong click, I can hit backspace and fix it, continue on, hit enter to complete my shape. Now when I select this tool, I do get a few of the properties up here on the property bar. And we have different walk types. The first type is a walk normal, and that is one line of stitching after the other. So let me get an example of this up here. And a few of these are going to look identical on screen. I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to move this down. And I'm going to change this second one, and I just duplicated by holding Control and hitting D on my keyboard to make two of them. I'm going to move this down. I'm going to change that second one to a walk bean. And then I'm going to zoom in here so that we can look at the difference on these. Deselect that, and let me grab my Markup Tool. Let's do this in blue. Grab that tool, minimize that. All right, so a walk normal, so this is a walk normal, is just one line of stitching after the other. One, and then again, and then again. There we go, one after the other. Whereas a walk bean is sometimes referred to as a triple run, where it goes forward, but then it comes back and forward again. So each segment is essentially 3 threads thick. And you can change that. You can do pretty much any odd number up to, I believe, 13. You get that big and it kind of gets out of control. It's really, really thick. Go forward, back, forward, forward, back, forward. So it's a little bit thicker. Walk beans tend to be used more for details, outlines on smaller logos or things like that. It can have a little bit of a marquee look where you have a few stitches that are kind of puffing out and creating almost like it's lined in lights, kind of like a big billboard. All right, let me get back out of this tool, clear this off, get back out of my tool, come back down. If I look at the properties for this, I have a walk bean, I have my stitch length, so that's the length between those needle penetrations. Remember that longer stitches stay up out of the fabric, shorter stitches sink down in. Length equals loft in embroidery. I can change that length. So the longer I make this, the farther apart those needle penetrations get. and typical and sometimes ideal stitch length for these is going to be 20 points. That's 2 millimeters. There's 10 points to a millimeter. And then I have my bean thickness. And again, I can do any thickness between 3 and 13 as long as it's an odd number. That way it can still move forward. Another option that I have, let me duplicate this walk normal again. So another way to do that is right click on the element, go to duplicate. Let me move this down. Another option that we have is we can turn on Retrace. So as I do this, you'll notice that the exit point, that little red X, shifted over so it's overlapping the green circle that is my entry point. That means that it will start and exit at the same point. So let me scoot over, zoom out a little bit, get back to my Markup Tool. There we go. So the walk normal, which is this guy, walk normal, goes all in one direction. The walk retrace goes all the way across and then it turns around and comes all the way back, so it ends right where it began. The walk bean, this third one down here, goes forward, back, forward, all the way across the element. So it's still traveling in one direction. There we go. And it is now 3 threads thick. The walk retrace, because it goes forward and back, is 2 threads thick, and a walk normal is 1 thread thick. If you're looking at all of these in a sew out, the difference in 1 and 2 is very much more noticeable than the difference in 2 and 3. So if we're creating a design where we're having an outline and doing some detail work, we may want to alternate between the walk retrace and the walk bean so that we can hide the difference in the thread thickness. All right, for an example of that, because I realize that's kind of abstract, let's look as if we were creating a leaf. So I'm going to grab a fill. I know we haven't talked about a fill yet, but I'm going to grab a fill and I'll create a leaf shape real quick. Entry, exit, stitch direction. I know we've not talked about that yet, but we will. in another video. All right, so we've got this leaf shape, and I know that I really want some detail work on this leaf. And I want to be very, very efficient about how I do it, and I don't want to have a trim. So I'm going to grab my walk. I'm going to change this to a walk bean because I want that to have a little bit more thickness and be a little bit more visible. And again, on screen you're not going to notice that difference, but when you sew it out, you really will. I'm going to grab that. I'm going to grab a slightly darker green, and I'm going to go around the outside edge of this. So I'm following these curves. You can have multiple curve points. That's fine. I'm coming up to a sharp transition, so I left click to create that transition, come back around, all the way around this shape. There we go. Notice that I'm leaving a little bit of overlap. Stitches tend to pull in when they get to the sew out, so I'm giving myself a little bit of extra room. And then I'm coming back up to do the stem. All right, now here I may want a vein. To do a vein, I'm going to end this element, and then I'm going to grab a walk normal, but I'm going to do a retrace. That way I digitize one line of stitching, start here, left click, come back up, I right click, and notice that that propeller, that last stitch from the previous element, is in the same place. So it went back up and came back down. So it's stitching forward and back and ending right where I began, so I can begin my next vein. Coming across here, enter, and again, same place. So now I can move forward again. To move forward, I would grab my walk bean, I would turn off retrace, because I do want to actually move in a direction. Come forward, and then we'll do one more little set of veins. Come up, grab my walk normal, grab my retrace. There's one. Start with the left click, right, left. There's the other. Again, it's ending right where it began. Turn off my retrace, grab my walk bean. Now, I'm going to turn this back on just for a minute. If you digitize one and you're like in the middle of digitizing and you realize, wow, I really forgot to turn that off, it's not a big deal. I can go back to my edit mode, I can select that element, and all I have to do is uncheck that to turn off that retrace. So those are the main properties of the walk normal and the walk bean. There's one other property. If I right click on it and go, not right there, if I right click on it and go to properties, there is one other element in here I'd like you guys to understand a little bit better, and that's curve compensation. So longer stitches are going to create more straight lines. It's just the way that stitching is. A stitch is a straight line between two needle penetrations. You can't actually curve a stitch. Let me take a walk normal, turn off retrace, and let me make the stitch length something really long. So as I digitize this, you can see that my stitch lengths are really, really long. If I make a curve out of that, let me go into my properties really quick. You can see that it's got more of a geometric shape, almost an octagonal look. If I turn on curve compensation, it will begin to shrink some of these elements to create a smoother look. And as I shrink this down and make a tighter curve, it will shrink those stitches even more to better accommodate those curves. Now I know it still looks a little octagonal, but that's because we are zoomed in crazy amounts on a little tiny curve of stitching. Curve compensation is a nice way to kind of save stitches, but when you need them to be a little bit tighter to navigate those curves a little bit more smoothly, you've got it. The walk normal, again, is a great way to travel from one element to a next without trimming. It's also a great way to give yourself some manual underlay. And then the walk bean and the walk retrace are going to be great ways to create some finer details in your design. There are a few more properties, or rather walk types, that are available. If we look back at the properties here, I have a walk jump. This is a much older command that digitizes the exact same way, however it doesn't create any stitches at all. That's for moving the machine without creating stitches. Not used overly often anymore. The other one is a walk decorative. Now this is a level dependent feature. This depends on what level of DesignShop you have. what it allows you to do is choose a pattern, let's say leaves, and you digitize, let's get back here, walk decorative, leaves. It allows you to digitize one path, and it will have a pattern that follows along that path. The same thing for a walk sequin. Allows you to have sequins along that path. And again, these are level dependent features and not used overly often, but occasionally they're really handy. The ones that you're going to be using most often, again, that walk normal, walk retrace, and that walk bean, those are going to be your best friends for getting around a design, creating those outlines and fine details, and avoiding trims.